Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give this a go. This will be part one of the series I've been alluding to for a while that I've been working on, and which I posted an introduction to a week or so ago. It's called Sonic Futurism 101, and my subtitle was A Personal History of Space Rock and Science Fiction Music in 101 Albums. So I gave you pretty much in the introduction the criteria for which I made the selections. Of course, these things are always going to be subjective ultimately, but it is that's why I call it a personal history. Anyway, I'm going through the history of these kind of musics and in chronological order of the release of the work. And I've chosen the ones that are both emblematic of its type or its era and related to an aspect of futuristic uh, themes. Um, and I've chosen my personal favorites that I wish to represent those things with. You may pick a different album, by one of these groups and say, I think this one in this year should represent this facet. And that's cool. You can make a list of your own. It's fun. It's very time consuming. Uh, I have a playlist of 101 albums. I'm going to discuss a very small amount today to get us started. And I'm going to put links under the video to where you can listen to the albums I'm talking about. Either if they exist in playlist form, I've compiled them into my own playlists from individual tracks on YouTube. And if the album in its entirety is on YouTube, I have put that in my playlist. So I'll have links to both of those things, links to my playlists and links to the individual albums, whatever it is, what have you. So, I don't want to go into a big, long, like history of the world in the beginning kind of thing. I've decided to start though with 1951, and the first album that I wanted to talk about was Bernard Herrmann's soundtrack to The Day the Earth Stood Still. And I almost went a little bit later into the next one I'm going to talk about. Started there, but I really thought about the influence of this soundtrack. And really now you're looking at if you call space music or futuristic music, sci-fi music, what have you, a genre, then this brings the genre to 70 full years this year that it's been viable and producing works, and it's not going anywhere because there's tons of this work being produced all the time. Um, as we get closer to the modern day, you'll see that. Um, so basically, with Forbidden Planet, um, I'm sorry, with Day the Earth Stood Still, my bad. Um, I guess they wanted to do kind of a futuristic, evocative, futuristic, kind of eerie sounding work, and it was Herrmann's first soundtrack after he moved from New York to Hollywood, and he decided to choose kind of unusual instrumentation. He uses a violin, cello, and electric, all electric amplified, and notably two theremins, which the instrument that has kind of the antenna, and you kind of don't touch it. You kind of wave your hands around and gesticulate, and that controls the oscillations and the vibrations. And so you create music that way, and it's very eerie sounding, or can be anyway. It can be very melodious. But this, as far as I know, is the first film using a theremin. They used two of them. One was played by a guy named Samuel Hoffman, and one was played by a guy named Paul Schur. and they also use two Hammond organs, a big studio electric organ, vibes, glockenspiels, pianos, harps, trumpets, there were horns, and a lot of percussion with cymbals and tam tams. So it's a very rich score, and um, the first opening theme, which they call on the soundtrack album Prelude slash Outer Space slash Radar. It's about a 4 minute piece, and it has that theremin at the forefront, and it sets the mood for the whole album. So that, to me, from there forward, that eerie theremin woo is kind of synonymous with flying saucers, spaceships, things from other worlds, etc. Um, and has been used in that capacity quite a bit. So um, I also read that there was like some, especially for the time, people were doing tape experiments already by then, but not in the mainstream of music. But there was overdubbing and some tape reversal loops that early ones worked in there. I don't know how they mixed it or combined all these effects. Let me check something here. But in any case, um, yeah, it was a landmark. Herrmann did it unconventionally. A lot of it sounds like definitely an early '50s kind of drama thriller, horror, kind of tone to it. Very dramatic, but it also it's subdued at times. There's some minimalism there, and just like with the effects and the costumes, this movie is dated extremely well uh, in its look as being futuristic or otherworldly because of the minimalism. It's of the laser effects, are very minimalist and very, you know, uh, they're not a lot of flourishes. There's not a lot of bing bang pals going on, and this is way before Star Wars, and the robots just all plain metal, silver, and Klaatu just has a silver outfit with a helmet, and they're very simple, but they don't look cheap, and uh, to me, that kind of science fiction film is always going to date better than the ones where their reach exceeds their grasp, where they either don't have the money or don't have a creative enough production designer or special effects people or cinematographer to make these images stay convincing and interesting and kind of having a wide appeal. Um, an example of failure in this area, which I've brought up a lot to people over the years, uh, is Star Trek, the original series, and I believe there's merit to what I say about it because Paramount itself re-released the series at one point on DVD with updated digital effects or whatever. See, Star Trek kind of bit off more than it could chew. It wasn't like Twilight Zone or even The Outer Limits, which was a bit more ambitious and kind of kept it minimalism. Of course, those were in black and white, and the black and white photography was used to its favor, just like in Day the Earth Stood Still. Star Trek was gaudy and colorful, gaudily colorful, and a lot of the things, the effects weren't fully realized. The creatures weren't well designed or weren't convincing. Um, I think Star Trek had some good effects, but for what it was trying to do, it failed. It was kind of trying to do what Star Wars did in 1977 and just couldn't. Whereas Day of the Earth Still has not aged. Nothing in that looks uh, hokey or it's creative. It's the production design, the visions that went into it are very creative, and that extends over to the music too. There's one theme I really like where Gore the robot is summoned for the first time by Klaatu to protect Klaatu from these overeager soldiers and outside of the spaceship. And there's a piece called Gort slash the visor slash the telescope. That's 2.5 minutes of music, but Gort's coming as like this portentous, dooming kind of throbbing thing, and then you get into the visor where his visor opens and he shoots this laser. And again, it's very minimalistic. It's not like trying to be fancy. It's just like a line of white light, and it just hits the tanks and the guns, and the light envelops them, and then the light, uh, folds back in on itself, and the weapons are gone. So it looks convincing, it looks real, it looks cool, it's artistic, it looks interesting. Um, Someone else who had the same kind of aesthetic that has lasted even longer is Metropolis by Fritz Lang. Really, almost any fantasy film by Fritz Lang uh, holds up because the designs were so imaginative and they did just what they could with what they had to work with. And Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires is a really good example of that. It was influenced a lot by Forbidden Planet, which we'll talk about in a second. And it has the plain black leather jumpsuits and with the golden rim. And I mean, they're way ahead of their time looking. They look totally cool today. Spaceships, very minimalist, simple design. The lighting is immaculate. Uh, Atmosphere's great, but this is all hallmarks of Mario Bava. But anyway, this is a music series, not a film series. I do those too, but I am going to touch on film a bit as it's appropriate because there's going to be a handful of soundtrack albums in my 101 albums. Not a lot, but a few that I think are key to me anyway, especially. But this one I think is both, and so is the next one. So I took a little more notes on our next entry, and just to get me started off, and that is Forbidden Planet. Forbidden Planet soundtrack from 1956, and the music is by Bebe. I think I'm saying her name right. Bebe, Bebe, Bebe and Louis Barron, and they were a couple, and they created music together, and their stuff was highly experimental, and they had a studio in Greenwich Village in New York where they worked on avant-garde music, and they did a lot of their approach. They were perfect for science fiction because kind of what they were doing was science fiction sounding kind of things. In other words, they were using the science and technology of that time to try to create different sounds, to try to use tapes and loops and things that would trigger things and keep this almost to where music would create itself, which decades later Laurie Spiegel did a similar thing where she built the circuits herself and designed them in such a way that once employed it would start to replicate and create its own music. She's the designer, but the music's spontaneously happening, and I'm going to get to her too in this series eventually. So the Barons got their gig in 1956 for MGM Studios, and it was the first all electronic score for a commercial film. And basically, the way they did it was interesting. It also, like Day the Earth Stood Still, is very eerie and otherworldly, but even more so because it's all using all electronics. And they did the same thing that I mentioned a minute ago. They did what I mentioned a minute ago, and which, like I said, was later used by people like Laurie Spiegel, and they designed and constructed these electronic circuits themselves, and they were almost like scientists themselves. They had individual cybernetic circuits for particular themes or leitmotifs, and um, rather than using standard sound generators. So each circuit has like this pattern, or like a voice, and uh, they said that people told them that the tonalities remind them of what their dreams are like. And I think the credit on the movie is electronic tonalities, not music by, which sounds even cooler and makes it more interesting, but it was really because um, some contract lawyer from American Federation of Musicians, uh, not to upset the union or whatever, uh, didn't want music associated with it because the Barons didn't belong to the musicians union. So it became electronic tonalities. And as far as this one goes, um, it's a favorite of mine. It's a great movie too, and it really holds up. And again, it's kind of got that great design and minimalism to a lot of it, like the costumes and the effects, to where it's still believable, um, and nice to look at. Um, Harry Parch was originally hired to do the soundtrack. I think he's the guy who like made a bunch of homemade instruments that did avant-garde music. I've only heard a small amount of his stuff and read a little bit about him. Um, but yeah, the Barons were brought in and just going to do a few minutes of sound effects, and then after they heard it, they went ahead and gave them the green light to expand and take control of the soundtrack themselves. Um, and they didn't wish to go to Hollywood. They wanted to stay in their New York studio. So they made this there, and that's kind of some of the minutia. They never did another soundtrack, but man, that's a great one-off. So yeah, I would say that one is even. It was influenced by Day There Stood Still, and then it's even more iconic, more influential and paradigmatic of space music, the vibes of the going forward of what you know people at least back then expected to hear from it. Of course, that things changed as we moved away from orchestral and to electric instruments and rock instrumentation. But electronics are still that's the through line to all of this, the mainstay of almost all space rock and science fiction music. Not all, but almost all is prevalent electronics, and that's been since the theremin was used, they there's still, and then the techniques that the barons used. So after this, there was like a little flood of science fiction themed albums. We're kind of like in the cocktail culture, and what in modern times, thanks to the popularity of like the research books, that publisher uh, kind of permeated pop culture with the term incredibly strange music, which was derived from their other book, Incredibly Strange Films, which that in turn was derived from the name of one of those films, The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Mixed Up Zombies by Ray Dennis Steckler. So now it fell under the rubric of incredibly strange music. And when these books became kind of big hits for research, because most of their stuff was sort of underground, um, various record labels, Rhino in particular, and then some of the bigger studios dusted off their things in their archives and started re-releasing these, albums that were kind of spanning this thing, like cocktail music and space age bachelor pad music, exotica, things like Martin Denny that have jazz with like the faux indigenous tribal or primitive kind of vibe to it. And all of the stuff, for the most part, most of it was faux. I mean, it wasn't like that was it. It was kind of a very American kind of thing where it was kind of a superficial kind of music. And of course, it evolved into what was known as elevator music. And In the 1990s, with the release of those books and the reissue albums and compilations that started coming out, that whole wave gained a whole new generation of fans and gained a lot more traction, and people were taking it more seriously than they had in quite a while, because the pop rock era kind of knocked that kind of music aside. A lot of the people interviewed in the Incredibly Strange Music um, books kind of eschew rock music as it's become too mainstream, and it's too noisy, and then this stuff creates a calming mental environment or whatever. I listen to music in all different gears, so um, I appreciate both extremes and whatever in the middle. Um, I think extreme music, like heavy, loud, distorted, experimental, weird, is great, and I'm going to talk about a ton of it in this series. But I also think these kind of laid back, what some people would say cheesy, kind of music, which is also prevalently, like I've said before, called cocktail music, or colloquially space age bachelor music. So it's music for the space age. In other words, the space age where you have technology is now advancing, and it's coming into the hands of the middle class. The middle class is growing. Economic prosperity after World War II is taking hold, and um, it's like people have more leisure time and are still able to make enough money to support themselves and their families. Of course, that era died a long time ago. Even for the middle class white American person, can't do that anymore. Uh, that's another video, right? Um, but during that period, for those kind of people, that was possible, and so this was a very kind of fun, relaxing, or party kind of music. It was novel. There was a lot of the records were novelty. They had cool covers, usually like with beautiful women on them, or like really strange kind of paintings, or exotic vistas, depending on what kind of niche of uh, incredibly strange, so to speak, music it was. So the space music was part of this space age music, which I've tried to select one that was I'm going to do an honorable mentions list after the one-on-one albums. So I've got a couple of there that don't make the one-on-one, but I did whittle it down, and there's two that I think are important, and that I like, that I enjoyed the most. So I'm trying to satisfy both criteria. And one is called Fantastica, Music from Outer Space. This is by Russell Garcia. It's an American album from 1959. So 3 years on from the Forbidden Planet soundtrack. And there were other works, and some which, like I said, will make an honorable mentions list. They're notable, like Sid Bass did an album called From Another World in 1956, which that is a key work. But Fantastica was like basically, um, it was kind of the model for science fiction concept albums, non soundtrack. And in other words, to where each track, uh, or at least most of the tracks, if not all, uh, had a science fiction flavor or theme, and that was to some extent or another manifest in the music. Not always. Sometimes the music was kind of fairly banal compared to the titles. So I've kind of bore that in mind as well. So Fantastica, I thought, satisfied the different criteria where it does have that eeriness, and that moodiness, the atmosphere, but it's also a little lighter and, or they said back then, gayer. And it manages to uh, work as space music, and as just cocktail music. Um, but basically, you know, Uh, anything else notable about this? I would say it kind of combines, jazz, exotica, lounge music, um, but orchestral, kind of light orchestral kind of pop, stuff you would hear in like TV and movie themes. especially television of that period. Um, but uh, what I wrote in my notes originally was that this kind of looks forward to the sounds, kind of harnessing some of these science fiction sounds in the soundtrack or themes, memorable themes uh, used in Star Trek by Alexander Courage, that theme by Alexander Courage. So that's a place where Star Trek, within this context, it definitely does hold up and was very appropriate. They used appropriate music just as the two albums that we just talked about did, and so that theme is still used today. I mean, it's used kind of, I believe, at the end of Star Trek Discovery series. Um, so there's like whimsical parts of Fantastica that remind me of like Raymond Scott, who was kind of considered an avant-garde composer, but and he did all the weird, quirky soundtracks for the Warner Brothers cartoons. So again, you had a commercial vehicle that was had experimental elements that were coming up into the mainstream. So Fantastica is a good one. Next one that's important is really important, and some people call it the first space rock album. Uh, so this album was began recorded in 1959 and was finished in 1960. It wasn't officially released until much later, so it didn't have the immediate influence or impact that the prior albums I've talked about did. However, because of when it was made and then the audience it eventually garnered, it's important. So this one's called "I Hear a World" by Joe Meek, and Joe Meek was a record producer. Uh, he wasn't like a Phil Spector level of fame, but he was experimenting and trying different things. Um, to me, this kind of brought together all these otherworldly sounds and vibes uh, from the post Forbidden Planet era. So, the stuff like Sid Bass and Russell Garcia and stuff kind of congealed in this, but Joe Meek took it a lot further. He composed this stuff and it was more ambitious. And all of the tracks had science fiction themes, and a lot of them were trying to emulate otherworldly textures and bringing electronic stuff again to the forefront, more so than the cocktail music was. Um, and really, it was a fascinating project, um, and it's one of those ones where I've listened to it a number of times, and it's it's not like a consistently moody of a consistent mood or atmosphere like the previous three albums that I was talking about. It kind of has a lot of different moods to it, um, and I Hear a New World. The title track is just really bizarre. By the way, the album's subtitled "In Outer Space Music Fantasy," and the musical group featured on it that are realizing Joe Meek's compositions were known as the Blue Men, and it says directed by Rod Freeman. I don't know if that means conducted or whatever. Um, but there's like tracks like Orbit Around the Moon, Enter of the Globots, um, March of the Dribcots, Love Dance of the Saru. So they're making up their own alien races here, and these different tracks are giving you a feeling for that particular concept. It's like there's magnetic field, um, Dribcot space boat. So these Dribcots and Sarus are on some kind of planet far away, and they're with the Globots. And ends with Valley of No Return, but it's a very you really kind of have to hear it. I wish I could play parts of these, but my own technical deficiencies and soundtrack issues with YouTube, I really can't. Um, but like I said, the links are going to be down below, so you can check out this album. As soon as you finish watching this, you can hear Joe Meek, "I Hear a World." I Hear a New World. I'm sorry, is the name of it, not "I Hear a World." I Hear a New World. Um, and it's kind of a prophetic work. Space rock was the new world, and space music. before it, but what evolved into space rock. This was the beginnings of space rock, and it had a little more of a rock flavor. But we're going to get into uh, who really uh, made space rock a fully realized thing, uh, and that's a few years down the road from Joe Meek's "I Hear a New World" from 1960. Uh, so next time, however, instead of diving into space rock, we're still it's proper. We're still going to um, go in chronological order, and there's actually a couple of records here. Both are 1962 that I'm going to cover next time. I would cover them this time, but I think I would run like super long because there's a lot to say about these because these are landmarks and they're both by the artist Sun Ra. And of course, he's a jazz artist, but his music has had he's explored all different subgenres of music, like everything over a long career and dozens of albums. He's to me, he's the single most important figure in space music and science fiction music. Um, the single most important rock band. I'm just going to go ahead and say it because we'll get to them. Obviously, is Hawkwind. Um, I have a lot to say about that. Most of the artists that I've chosen for this 101 albums, I've just chosen one album per artist. There's a handful of artists who warrant like two or three of their albums being in it because of their importance, their quality, what have you. And Sun Ra is one of those. Sun Ra has 5 albums in my 101, and Hawkwind has 5 as well. So you can start guessing which albums I picked. But the two I'm going to discuss next both came out in 1962, and they were the real turning point where Sun Ra went from just like some album titles and song titles and flirtation, and then his normal persona he had as being from Saturn and his stage presence. He went that from that into albums that, and not all of his albums were like that thereafter, but albums where you had every track, they were more like concept albums. Every track had a particular theme in the title and in the sound itself that usually complemented the title, and they were all based on science fiction themes and tropes and uh, outer space, space travel, advanced technology. He covered everything, and that was kind of his bailiwick, so to speak, or wheelhouse, as people would say nowadays. And I think he's the only guy in jazz that that was the majority. That was his thing. And in rock, I'd say Hawkwind is not the only, but the preeminent band who almost all of their material, musically and lyrically, is science fiction oriented. I can't say every single song, um, and I can't say that they're all the same genre of science fiction. They cover a wide range, but we'll get to them not next episode, but soon. And next episode, I'll lead off with these 2 Sun Ra albums, and then we'll get down to some work in the 60s as space rock kind of coalesces and codifies into a real subgenre. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon. Don't know when. I'm trying to make these as high quality as I can and thought out. So quality over quantity or what have you, quality over frequency, but it will be soon. So thank you, and I haven't come up with any kind of science fiction gimmicky kind of sign off yet, and I probably won't. But that would be inserted here if I had one. So take care.